Thanks, Vali, for joining us at India Economic Conclave. I think, he deserves a bigger round of applause. He has made special effort flying all the way from Europe. And he has been, listening to all sessions which are going on since morning. But we'll come back to our topic. It's quite interesting, India, Trump, and, geopolitics. When the US election results came, there was a sense of ecstasy in India because people were quite happy that Trump is back. I mean, a very large part of population was quite happy. And there is a belief that he'll be good for India. We'll get to that. But my first question is, you have been following geopolitics, especially what's happening in Middle East and all over the world very closely. How are you looking at the geopolitical world at this point in time?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this conclave. It's really great being here. I mean, in many ways, just the election of President Trump changes everything because, first of all, his priority is the United States. His first priority is America, which means that geopolitical issues generally matter to him less. He's not one who has a vision that I'm going to change the world in terms of his geopolitics. Secondly, his agenda internationally is really geoeconomics, which is to ensure America's primacy in global economic affairs, and that makes China first and then Europe his primary targets. Geopolitics really to him only matters insofar as geoeconomics matters. And I think his first instinct would be that geopolitical issues do not meddle with his geoeconomic issues. So the war in Ukraine or the conflict in the Middle East will only matter to him insofar as either they help his geoeconomic vision or he would want to stop them in order to prevent them from having an impact on geoeconomic issues. So everything the way we think about Ukraine or the way we think about the Middle East and where it's going has to be understood in terms of Trump's priorities.
Right. In Indian context, and it's happening quite close to, our borders geographically, if not immediate borders. But what's happening in Middle East, and I want to start with Syria, because that's the most recent development, but you also have the Israel conflict, which is brewing for quite some time, and then you have the Red Sea situation, which is going on for quite some time. So let's start with Syria right now. What has happened in Syria? What kind of impact it will have in the Middle East?
Well, the war in Gaza that started on October 7th was initially seen as a localized war between Palestinians and Israelis as a reaction to a terrorist attack and then about Israel's security. But it's almost like a crack that opens in a wall or on the ground, and it keeps expanding and expanding. And so we saw that it went from Gaza, it went to Lebanon, it involved Iran, and now it's gone to Syria. Now, the importance of Syria is that what's happening in Syria is going to change the balance of power in the region as a whole. It's changing the balance of power between Iran and Israel because it's really expelled Iran from the Levant area altogether, but it has given rise to Turkey as a new power player in the region. Turkey was behind the takeover of Damascus by the rebels. It's the rebels' main backer. It is now the foreign power on the ground in charge of Syria. We don't think of it that way, but in reality, that's the case. So that changed the dynamic between Israel and Turkey because Israel's problem is no longer Iran in Syria. It's now Turkey in Syria managing that relationship. For Iran, the rise of Turkey in this manner has broad implications in the region. And then the Arab countries, many of whom are much closer in terms of trade to India, the countries in the Gulf, they have a very low tolerance for the kind of Islamic government that has come to power in Syria. And so they are going to be very involved in terms of protecting themselves from what might be the political implications of the takeover by an Islamist force in Syria. So Syria, in a way, is where the future of this region is going to be written.
Right. I want to, extend this question from Indian context. If you look at Mr. Trump, he is a believer in personal chemistry. A lot of his policies are actually driven by how he clicks with the other head of state. And we have seen that in the past, the way he used to connect with Mr. Putin, the way he connected with Mr. Modi, and even now he connects with Mr. Modi. India is in a unique sweet spot. It has good relations and good influence on Israel. It has reasonably solid influence on Russia. And it happens to be a major counterbalance to China. So, you can't be in a better than that position dealing with Mr. Trump. Do you think he will leverage the personal equity that Prime Minister Modi has with Mr. Putin, or the equations that India has with Israel, to resolve some of the larger issues in the Middle East and, let's say, Ukraine war?
Well, I mean, my sense would be, or at least let me begin by saying that in the United States, in the first term of Mr. Trump, what we saw that he did have very good chemistry with Prime Minister Modi, and that India got a lot of benefit essentially from exploring and exploiting the space that Mr. Trump's policies were creating. So pressuring China out of the global economy, trying to downsize its importance in the global supply chain, all benefited India. Then President Biden's emphasis on security in the Indo-Pacific, the ideas of AUKUS and the Quad, etc., also all benefited India. Now, what we're seeing is whether India, how it will play for India, not from India to the east, but from India to the west, in other words, the West Asia region. And there the questions is first of all, why would India see benefit in actually getting involved in resolving any issues? Yes, India has very good relations with Israel. India has very good relations with the Gulf state. India has had in the past investments in India, in the port of Chabahar, and trying to use Iran's links to Central Asia and Afghanistan as a way of going around Pakistan in order to strengthen those ties. And perhaps India will be important to the future Iran would be important to the future of India-Russia trade. But the question is, how would India see benefit in actually getting involved in these issues? Secondly, is that India would probably have to see how the developments in the Middle East impact it. For instance, India is putting a lot of emphasis on the trade routes that are being built from India to the Mediterranean. Well, these routes ultimately have to go through the areas where the war in Syria, the war in Gaza, the war in Lebanon are impacting. I mean, to get to the Mediterranean, you have to go through these very difficult regions. And so the future of these trade routes are going to be impacted by these conflicts. India will benefit from the improvement of relations between the northern and the southern shores of the Gulf, between UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And so in many ways, I think India's economic vision for West Asia is subject to or at risk by what happens in the Middle East. And so I think perhaps its urge would be how it can help maintain the peace rather than to resolve much more complicated sets of issues on the ground.
Right. So what I'm hearing is you feel India should steer clear of any such from getting involved in trying to resolve a conflict. It may not really happen in the immediate future.
Well, the one case we had when China mediated between Iran and Saudi Arabia was when those two countries looked for somebody to help them to get past the last mile to arrive at a peace. So yes, India can play a very positive role between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and UAE and Saudi Arabia. But the issues of, let's say, resolving problems between Israel and Iran is much more complicated and difficult. And those two countries have to want India to play that role. That's where India can have the greatest amount of influence, is actually to bridge the last bit after those countries are willing to do so. And of course, it benefits India if West Asia is in peace, because the economic vision that India has of playing a big trade partner with West Asia, connecting East and West Asia, will benefit from peace in the region. But the region has to want peace, and it has to be moving in that direction before India can use its influence.
Right. Okay. Let me now focus on a bit of economic situation. Mr. Trump is known to be slightly unpredictable. So, and in fact, 10 days back, I was reading one of his statements where he almost threatened BRICS countries that dare you try and dethrone dollar from its supreme position. It'll result in catastrophic, results. My question is, he is very clear, even his election campaign was totally focused on making America great again. In such a scenario where his priorities are so clear, black and white, where does India stand? If we keep geopolitics aside and purely look at it from trade and economy point of view, where does India stand? He has a bigger war probably to fight with maybe China, but where do you see India?
Well, I mean, his threat to the BRICS was not actually unpredictable. There he's actually basically saying, I will not tolerate any other economic power or any other economic mechanisms threatening the supremacy of the dollar. I mean, ultimately, the way President Trump is going to pressure the world is by using America's economic power. Now, these are the tariffs, which he can use against countries. It's sanctions, which he can use against countries, including the BRICS. But it's also using the dollar supremacy. In other words, the fact that the dollar is the economy of the world and also the financial networks like the SWIFT banking system that support it. So he's basically saying that I'm not going to even allow a group of countries to come up with ways around going around the dollar. And India is obviously part of the BRICS, and I think that there is now a consensus within BRICS that there needs to be mechanisms that allows countries around the world to be able to resist unilateral American economic pressure. After all, countries, even including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, etc., are showing interest in joining the BRICS exactly because all of them think they might be only one step away from being subject of America's economic wrath. Now, in some ways, India is not a target of America's economic wrath. As I mentioned, it's first China, then it's Europe. But if India continues to rise at the pace that it is, if it does become part of the top 3 economic powers in the has to address. And I think there his very first priority will be the war in Ukraine, which is to end that war one way or the other. Now, whether he's going to succeed or not is open to question. But if he succeeds in ending the war in Ukraine, it will be also a first step in peeling off Russia from China. And then the question is, if he gets to the Middle East, I think the issues of the western part of the Middle East, which is the Arab-Israeli issue, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, is different from the issues on the eastern part of the Middle East, which is maintaining peace in the Gulf and perhaps arriving at a deal with Iran. This is really the open question. Is Iran now weakened, having been pushed out of Syria, open to talking to the U.S.? And is the U.S. interested in talking to Iran? And is there a deal there? If there is a deal between Iran and the United States, even a sort of a ceasefire deal, it will be an effort to also peel Iran off of China as well. And then also, obviously, that will have benefits for India because it might remove some of the sanctions that have prevented India from benefiting from its own investment in Chabahar. But if you thought about this, then the two sort of narrow geopolitical deals will help Trump's overall geoeconomic goal of isolating China. And then, issues like AUKUS, Taiwan, etc., will further serve America's interest of isolating China economically. And in all of this, in the short run, there are benefits to be made by India in Iran, vis-a-vis Russia, but also in East Asia, because India sort of sits in the middle of all the little geopolitical issues that ultimately, the ultimate goal of which is to weaken China economically, which also will provide room for India's economic growth.
Right. So is it safe to assume that Mr. Trump would actively encourage and pursue China plus one policy, which will have a direct benefit for India?
Yes, I would say so. I would say that is now sort of a consensus domestically within the Republican Democratic Party that there are many other issues around the world, but the issue that matters to the United States most is containing China's rise and, in fact, downsizing China. Not just slowing its growth, but actually bring it down. Now, that creates space for the other major economic players. Europe is not in a position to take advantage of this because it has its own issues with the United States, but India clearly would be the most important beneficiary of the space that is created by American pressure on China.
Right. So, from Indian perspective, how should India deal with Trump 2.0?
Well, far-fetched for me to sort of give advice to India. I think it's done pretty well as it is. In other words, at least initially, India just needs to invest in all the economic infrastructure issues and decisions to basically be the beneficiary of what comes out of China, manufacturing, technology, etc. But then also India should be prepared to take advantage of geopolitical openings that particularly an American peace with Russia, an American peace with Iran would entail. Where President Trump is very different from the Democrats is that he is actually prepared to deal with America's enemies in ways that allows the American enemies to take him seriously. So President Putin probably did not see the possibility of a peace in Ukraine and the lifting of sanctions on Russia under the Democrats. And I think that's true of Iran as well, that there are circumstances in which they think that as difficult as President Trump is, he's transactional, he's not ideological. He doesn't come with a baggage of American attitudes towards enemies. And if it's transactional, then you could make a deal with him. Now, what do those deals mean? Means that we stop what we're doing that America doesn't like, war in Ukraine and nuclear advancement in the case of Iran and some of Iran's regional policies. Now, the lifting of those sanctions immediately benefits India, because India has had trade relationship with these countries. And it can go back to those trade relationships, again, without fearing angering America. And that also enables India to become a bigger trade player between East and West Asia. And I think those countries, both China and Iran, but also the Gulf countries, which are interested in trade with China and with Iran, will benefit. So this idea of a trade route coming out of India need not be just straight towards the Mediterranean, which now also has problems, but it could come to the Gulf and then take a detour northwards as well, without fear of sanctions, which will benefit India.
Right. So your closing remarks. We are, to some extent, we are going to get into slightly unpredictable and volatile situation thanks to the new US administration and thanks to the developments which are taking place in Middle East. But probably one thing which is certain is that India is likely to remain fastest growing large economy in the coming years, and it's a matter of time before we hit the spot in the top 3 economies in the world.
So 2 things about that. One is that in all of our conversations, we often assume that nothing happens within the United States itself. We forget that President Trump has a very, very ambitious domestic agenda in the United States. And it's not a given that that's going to go smoothly. And that is not going to write its own rules and may force his hand on the international scene as well. We have to consider, can he handle domestic American politics and domestic American agenda, and yet also follow the policies that he wants vis-a-vis China, Ukraine, Iran, etc. So we have to consider that. Secondly, the question is, how long is the Trump administration? Are we talking about 2 years, 4 years, or are we looking at 8 to 10 years? The longer we look, the more India's own economic rise would change its profile in American eyes. In the short term, India will only benefit because the focus is on everywhere else, and whatever America does, if it does it successfully, it actually creates space for India. But at some point in time, the issue will not be China. The issue may very well be India itself. So this is an issue of phases. In the first phase, India just needs to sit back and take advantage of what happens. But in the second phase, it has to have a forward strategy of managing America.
Well, very well said. Thank you so much, Vali, for joining us on this.